So with thanks to all those who assisted in relation to the date, the video that we looked at before the break is November 1987.
November 87?
That's what I understand.
Right.
Reliably, yes, there are lots of nods from the audience, yes. November 87. I've also been assisted over the break with the likely date for the letter from Dr. Tomlinson that we looked at, September, and then the year was unclear. And I'm very grateful to the member of the Haemophilia Society who forwarded some information in that regard and suggested, and this sounds right, that it's probably September 1985 because it refers to media interest in a school in Hampshire, and it was in September 1985 in which there was some interest in precisely that topic. So it would seem to fit that would be September 1985.
Yes, thank you.
And then to return then to some of the documents about research at Treloar's, if we go back in time from the document that we were looking at to 1970, AMRE 5012_004, we see here a letter from Dr. Biggs in her capacity as director of the Oxford Haemophilia Centre supporting the continuation of funding for research at Treloar's. So the letter's dated the 14th of December 1970, and she says, in relation to application from the Lord Mayor Treloar Trust, Alton Hants, I feel this grant should be continued for a number of reasons. One, the collection of 49 haemophilic patients at the Alton School makes this a unique opportunity to study the disease. So again, that way of looking at the pupils there, which we've seen in really so many documents, are here articulated by Dr. Biggs. The patients are particularly important since crippling is still occurring and the question of prevention is under study. The work which Dr. Rainsford has already done has defined the essential organisation required to treat boys gathered into one school. This was in itself a major research objective which has been achieved. As a result of this work and the efforts of local specialists in the regional and the Wessex Regional Hospital Board, a basic service for the treatment of the boy should soon be set up, which will enable the research fellow to concentrate on purely research projects. In addition to the basic organisational research, Dr. Rainsford has already initiated 7 other research projects, all of which are important and will cease if support for research is not forthcoming. Good cooperation has already been established between the work being carried out at Alton and the work of other research centres, particularly the one at Oxford, and we feel that it is most desirable for this cooperative work to continue. Although not specifically stated in this application, it's intended that Dr. Rainsford should continue as Research Fellow. Dr. Rainsford has already shown himself to be an able organiser, to have many original ideas of his own, and to have immense energy and ability in obtaining cooperation from other scientists. And there's a little more information about Dr. Rainsford's work at this time from AMRE 5011_066. So this is a letter from Dr. Rainsford himself, July 1970, and you'll see it's addressed, as was Dr. Biggs' letter, to Mr. Guthrie, and Mr. Guthrie is the director of the National Fund for Research into Crippling Diseases. Dr. Rainsford says this: I think I ought to bring you up to date with regards to the research programme now being carried out here. In the original suggested outline of research, 6 specific questions were posed, about which, with the exception of question 3, conclusions have been reached by the time I was appointed. With regard to question 3, epidemiological evidence here would appear to show that no beneficial advantage would be obtained from regular prophylactic injections, largely because of the short half-life of factor VIII in the body. The present research programme has been planned so that there should be no overlapping with that being carried out at Oxford. At present, 4 separate research projects are being undertaken, and then he gives details of those 4 projects. Project 1, epidemiological evidence collected here suggests that there's some seasonal variation in the tendency to bleed in both haemophilia and Christmas disease. And so, again, if we just skip down, we can see he says, it's thought that more evidence on these observations may be of fundamental importance, and the plasma cortisol levels of the boy suffering from these diseases is being routinely examined throughout the year. And we're told that that's a an investigation being carried out in cooperation with Dr. Shaw and Mrs. Richardson, consultant pathologist and principal biochemist, respectively, at the Royal Hampshire County Hospital. So that's project 1. Project 2 it involves, and I'm picking this up from the third line of that paragraph, sera being examined for the presence of rheumatoid arthritis antibody, and that's said to be a joint investigation, both clinical and pathological, being conducted by Mr. Stanley Evans and myself. It's described as a fairly long-term project, and the relationship between rheumatoid arthritis antibody and the possible development of inhibitors for factor 8 is being studied. If we go over the page, project 3 refers to a recent report about immunoglobulins in haemophilia, and Dr. Rainsford says this was discussed with Professor Nicholas Martin and Dr. Rosemary Biggs, and the serum of all our boys with haemophilia and Christmas disease is being quantitatively examined for the immunoglobulins likely to be involved. These investigations may indicate those boys likely to develop inhibitors for factor 8, and it's explained that that's a project being undertaken in cooperation with Professor Martin and Dr. Sharrard at the St George's Medical School. And then project 4, investigations carried out in conjunction with the Virus Reference Laboratory, Public Health Laboratory Service with Dr. Yvonne Cossart, has shown that the incidence of antibody to Australia antigen is extremely high in our cases of Christmas disease and haemophilia. Dr. Cossart has arranged to carry out regular examination of our cases for this antibody and possibly to screen all the materials being administered for Australia antigen. It is probable that much may be learned of the cause of serum hepatitis, and its prevention could well be the outcome of these investigations. Furthermore, there's a serious shortage of sera for the detection of Australia antigen in this country, and the supply of sera from these boys will therefore greatly augment the present national bank of Australia antibody sera, which will permit more widespread research into the relationship between the presence of Australia antigen and hepatitis. Dr. Biggs has approved this programme and all the projects are well underway. So that's an indication of some of the research work being undertaken by Dr. Rainsford in 1970. So.
Indeed, the Biggs letter from 1970, her support for Dr. Rainsford, the way that she is describing for those purposes how haemophilia, boys suffering from haemophilia came to be at Lord Mayor Treloar's was because it was a research project.
Yes, she refers to the organisational work undertaken by Dr. Rainsford.
And he's saying, well, Rainsford brought together a group of boys specifically to research them.
That appears to be what she's saying, so yes.
Yes.
And then we can see if we go to AMRE 607_002. An indication of some funding that was made available by what was subsequently renamed Action Research for the Crippled Child. So I don't think there's a date on this letter, but in any event, it refers to an application having been received from Mr. Evans, FRCS of the Lord Mayor Treloar Trust, for a grant of £24,815. But then we can see that historically some of the grants made available. So in July 1967, £10,000 was made available to the Lord Mayor Treloar Trust for a 3-year investigation at the Lord Mayor Treloar College and at the Blood Coagulation Research Unit, Oxford, of treatment of acute joint and muscle hemorrhage in haemophilia. And then in January 1971, £15,000 was made available to the Lord Mayor Treloar Trust for the continuation for 3 years of the grant for research into haemophilia. I don't think this document tells us what happens to the further application that's referred to at the top of the page. If we then go to AMRE 5011_021, this is a document entitled Proposed Research Programme. Again, it's undated. We can tell that it's sometime earlier than August 1975 because there's a reference on the last page to that. And the text of it is quite similar to the first document we looked at. So we see again in the introduction reference to Treloar College being a unique establishment because of the more than 50 boys suffering from various coagulation defects in residence there and under continuous medical supervision. And then we can see set out in the second paragraph, again, arrangements for the treatment, which I think are largely a repetition of what we've already seen. The third paragraph refers again to the research fellowship established in 1968, and it talks about it being unfortunate if the organisation was allowed to lapse for lack of financial support. And the next paragraph then says, it will be seen from the foregoing that the college lends itself to a specific type of research into haemophilia and other coagulation disorders, namely to study the relationship between recognised laboratory findings and clinical observations in these somewhat uncommon conditions. It is also the only establishment in the UK which can provide the opportunity and the facilities for extensive clinical trials of various kinds of treatment. This type of research cannot at present be conducted anywhere else. And then there's a description of, under the heading Future Research, if we go over the page, at the end of that long first paragraph, there's a reference to a proposed research programme. One is measurement of platelet activity and its relationship to factor VIII related protein, and to determine whether basic levels of factor VIII and its related antigen have any influence on the frequency of bleeding in haemophilia. 2 is to determine whether the post-transfusion levels of factor VIII and its related antigen has a bearing on the frequency of bleeding. 3 is in relation to fibrinolysis, and there's a discussion there again about the clinical trial and tranexamic acid. 4, antithrombin. And then if we go over the page, we can see reference to completed projects, a 4-year study on the incidence of jaundice in the presence of Australia antigen and antibodies in boys being frequently transfused with blood products has now been completed in cooperation with the Virus Reference Laboratory, Public Health Laboratory Service, Colindale. 2 interim reports concerning this project have already been circulated. And then the second completed project is about plasma cortisol levels. The third is in relation to platelets. And then the fourth just refers to various other papers which are said to be of worldwide interest. Then we have the heading Current Projects, Prophylactic Trial, to determine whether a prophylactic transfusion of factor VIII administered at weekly intervals would reduce the frequency of bleeding in haemophilia, is now almost completed, and a report should shortly be available. 2 refers to the ongoing research project to determine whether there's a relationship between immune arthritis and factor VIII antibodies. And there's reference towards the bottom of that paragraph to pre- and post-transfusion samples of blood being examined by Dr. Holborough at Taplow. And then if we go over the page, and we can see that's to see whether there's some relationship to the development of kidney disease in haemophilia. And then we have the heading Summary. In proposing this future research, it should be mentioned that the Area Health Authority has agreed to provide the research fellow with a full-time research assistant on a permanent basis for as long as a fellowship exists. It must be fully realised that there's a limit to what the research fellow can accomplish with the help of one research assistant. It is, however, envisaged that the centre, which is now fully operational, well-staffed and well-equipped, will play a full part in assisting to carry out this proposed programme. It is considered that a fully trained and suitable candidate should be available in August 1975 to replace the present research fellow. This, of course, will depend on a 3-year grant being made available, which would secure his future professional advancement to consultant level. So this again appears to be looking at the recruitment of Dr. Kirk to supplement the work of Dr. Rainsford. And then, in addition, the Oxford Haemophilia Centre and the MRC Research Unit at Oxford have in the past assisted in all the research projects carried out at the college, and it is assumed that this close collaboration with the proposed research work will continue. It will therefore be necessary for this programme to be agreed, approved and sponsored by Dr. P.G. Arblaster, Consultant Physician and Director of the Treloar Haemophilia Centre, and Dr. Rosemary Biggs, Director of the Haemophilia Centre and MRC Research Unit at Oxford. So again, that's a broad update of the position as at the mid-1970s. And again, there's a letter a little earlier, November 73, from Dr. Biggs, AMRE 607_013, which makes clear the collaboration between Treloar's and Oxford. So we looked at her 1970 letter of support to Mr. Guthrie for funding for research. This is November 73, where she says, in my opinion, the research already carried out at Alton has been of very great importance. The careful records kept by Dr. Rainsford about the boys at Alton have been a great help in trying to estimate the requirements for the haemophilic community for factor 8, which is a very expensive therapeutic material. The projects proposed by Dr. Rainsford are all in the first degree original and important. I have a very high regard for Dr. Rainsford's ability in planning and carrying out his projects. In all the research work, very close cooperation has occurred between the Oxford Haemophilia Centre and those at Alton, and in some projects, advice has been taken from the Haemophilia Centre Directors' Conference. In my opinion, it's of the highest importance for research to carry on at Alton. The close cooperation between those working at the college and the research centre at Oxford is important, and I believe certain to continue beyond Dr. Rainsford's tenure of the post. The work proposed is likely greatly to improve our knowledge of the distressing crippling caused by haemophilia. And then there's a reference to the project in relation to rheumatoid arthritis. And then she says, I have no hesitation in supporting the application in full, particularly as I now believe that truly satisfactory arrangements are likely to be made for the day-to-day care of the boys at the college. I approve both the plan to extend Dr. Rainsford's tenure until 1975 and the plan to seek a new research fellow for 1976 and 1977. So I'm going to look now then at some of the specific pieces of research and specific trials that were undertaken, starting with prophylaxis. We can, again, there are multiple documents in relation to this, so I'm going to just go to a handful. If we can start with DHSC 01-00026_146. This is a letter dated the 19th of August 1972 from Dr. Arblaster to Dr. Wilson, a principal medical officer in the Department of Health and Social Security. And he says, I would be most grateful if the department would consider a research grant for a prophylactic trial in haemophilia to be conducted by the Treloar Haemophilia Centre. I enclose a copy of the protocol, which has been approved by Professor J. Howell, Chairman of the Research Committee of the Wessex Regional Hospital Board. It's also been approved by a meeting of several haemophilia treatment centre directors held under the chairmanship of Dr. Rosemary Biggs at Lord Mayor Treloar College. Some points need clarification, and then there's reference to the request for £20,000 is for the drug bill only. Current nursing, medical and secretarial staff should be able to service the trial. And then there's reference to terminology as between a switchback trial and crossover trial in paragraph 2. It says each boy would act as his own control, and where the trial duration is as planned, namely 6 terms, there would be 3 would be prophylaxis and 3 terms placebo. The double-blind method is suggested to exclude observer boys and perhaps even more important, patient boys. The haemophilia boys are great adepts at taking the mickey out of doctors and conducting their own treatment to suit scholastic and social inconveniences. And then 4, the Ethical Committee of the North Hampshire Hospital Management Committee have considered the protocol in its earlier form, and I'm sending the latest draft again today. So we can see there the request for financial support from the department. If we go to MRCO 5065_013, and we zoom in on the letter, we can see it's dated the 10th of January 1973, and it's addressed to Dr. Stewart at the Medical Research Council. If we go to the bottom of the page, we can see, I just want to see who it's from R. Harwood in the Research Division of the Department of Health and Social Security. And then we can see it says in the second paragraph, but if we just look at the heading first of all, I'm sorry, Shomik, so under Dear Mr. Stewart. Trial of factor 8 concentrates at Lord Mayor Treloar College. And in the second paragraph, the purpose of this letter is to give you formal notification that the department will meet the costs of the drugs used in the haemophilia trial of factor 8 concentrates up to a maximum of £4,000 in 1973-74. I understand that no other research costs are involved. It's anticipated the trial will start in April. I note that the MRC, so the Medical Research Council, intends to set up a small group on which DHSS will be represented to consider some revision of Dr. Arblaster's protocol and, if appropriate, to monitor the progress of the trial and assess its results. I take it you'll be in touch with Dr. Metters about this. Time is short if the trial is to begin at the start of the school term in April, and I know Dr. Arblaster is anxious to begin. And then we can see some further discussions about this trial. HCDO 301015, please. So this was a meeting of the Haemophilia Centre directors in October of 1972, and we can see Dr. Arenstam was present, as was Dr. Rainsford. And if we go to page 5, there's a discussion about the protocol for a trial of prophylactic therapy in haemophiliacs. Dr. Biggs said she'd been asked at the last meeting to prepare a protocol. She'd had a great deal of trouble with it. She'd sent it to a number of important persons to see what they thought of it, and they all objected to it for one reason or another. She concluded that it would be very difficult to organise a prophylactic trial from a haemophilia centre, and that perhaps the only place where it could be done would be at Lord Mayor Treloar College. She had sent the protocol to Drs. Arblaster, Arenstam and Rainsford at their request, and they were now planning to organise a trial along lines similar to those in the circulated protocol. Although there were difficulties in organising a trial and in the setting up of the control groups, Dr. Biggs felt it was very important for a trial to be undertaken because we really want to know whether the patients are better having prophylactic therapy or just receiving treatment on demand. There were sharp differences between these two modes of treatment. On-demand treatment means giving treatment at home or at hospital whenever a bleed occurred. Prophylaxis involves treatment at regular intervals regardless of whether or not bleeding occurs. Dr. Biggs suggested that the directors should support the conduct of this trial at the Lord Mayor Treloar College. And if we go over the page, it appears that there was a lengthy discussion at the Haemophilia Centre directors meeting about a prophylaxis trial, centring around 3 topics, in particular the placebo group, the material to be used, and details of the trial organisation. There's then a discussion about the placebo in the following paragraph. Says in the 4th line, some thought it very important that the placebo be indistinguishable from the treatment material, since it was essential that the boys should not know to which group they belonged. It was, however, pointed out that the boys could be told that they were receiving 2 different treatments. There's then a discussion about choice of material. It was decided that the trial material would have to be provided in addition to the material supplied for routine use at Lord Mayor Treloar College. The conclusion was that a freeze-dried concentrate should be used. Drs. Arblaster and Arenstam had decided to use the immunomaterial from Vienna if this was possible, and had applied to the Ministry of Health and Social Security for £15,000 to buy enough material. We've seen an exchange of correspondence in relation to the application to the Department of Health. It was pointed out that the Highland concentrate was also of good quality. Also, Drs. Maycock and Bidwell thought that they could supply enough material where they asked. Dr. Biggs said that, and that obviously would be NHS material, Dr. Biggs said she'd felt that any material which could be made in England was too urgently needed for treatment of serious bleeding for it to be allocated to a clinical trial of prophylactic therapy. So it would appear that the offer is made from Maycock and Bidwell of a supply of NHS concentrate for the prophylactic trial, and the view expressed by Dr. Biggs is don't use it for prophylaxis on the children. You save that more generally for treatment on demand. Then there's a discussion about the organisation of the trial. Questions asked about the treatment of boys during holidays. The trial treatment would have to lapse during holidays. This was a pity. Frequency of dosage was discussed. Dr. Matthews said that previous workers had advocated dosage varying in frequency from twice daily to once every 3 to 4 weeks. It was decided that once weekly was the most frequently that dosage could be given in practice, and that child treatment must be allowed to lapse during holidays. It was stated that 10 to 15 boys could be included in the trial at Lord Mayor Treloar College. Some wondered if any significant results could be obtained with so few boys. It was pointed out by Dr. Arenstam that each boy had many bleeds and that it was bleeding frequency which was to be used as a criterion of treatment effectiveness. Moreover, the boys would all have periods in the treatment group and in the control group. It was pointed out that since prophylactic treatment might treble the usage of factor VIII, only a highly significant result was of interest. And then the last paragraph on this page, cooperation of haemophilia centre directors would be required wherever possible to obtain parents' consent for boys in the child and to supervise boys in the holiday. And then over the page, under the heading Action, in conclusion, it was pointed out that details of this particular trial, including the choice of therapeutic materials and questions of ethics, were the responsibility of the Alton Centre, and it was proposed and agreed with one dissenting vote, Professor Stewart Middlesex, that the chairman should write to the Ministry of Health and Social Security supporting the conduct of the trial of prophylactic treatment at the Lord Mayor Treloar College. It was also agreed that the Haemophilia Society should be asked to make a contribution towards the cost of the trial. So that's the background and the discussion that took place amongst Haemophilia Centre directors. There are then a couple more documents, I think, of interest in relation to this issue. So if we go to AMRE 607_019. Again, it's not a brilliant copy. If we can see, it's headed Future Research. Observations made during the last 4 years at Lord Mayor Treloar College of boys suffering from haemophilia strongly suggest that the frequency and duration of spontaneous bleeding are not solely a function of the presence of inadequate amounts of factor VIII in the blood. These observations indicate the following lines of investigation might be pursued. And then there are various lines of investigation discussed. A number of different research projects. You'll see paragraph 6 refers to the serum hepatitis project continuing at the request of the Public Health Laboratory Service. And then we can see paragraph 7 talks about prophylaxis and this particular trial. It's not very easy to read, but it says, at a meeting attended by the directors of the various haemophilia treatment centres in the country, held at Oxford on the 27th of October 1972, so those are the minutes we've just looked at, it was unanimously agreed that a clinical trial to evaluate prophylactic therapy and the treatment of haemophilia should be carried out. It was decided that it should take the form of a double-blind crossover trial, and a protocol for such a trial was drawn up by Dr. Rosemary Biggs and discussed. It became obvious after discussion that such a trial could only be pursued at an establishment like Lord Mayor Treloar College, where boys are under close daily observation for prolonged periods and where meticulous day-to-day records on each boy are maintained. Primarily, this is due to the organisation already set up by the research fellow and his secretary, the cost of which is covered by the grant from the National Fund for Research into Crippling Diseases. Now that this organisation is established, the Lord Mayor Treloar College is an ideal centre for this type of research, and in this respect, it is unique in this country. It would therefore be a pity if such an organisation was allowed to lapse for lack of financial support. And then it refers to the Ministry of Health having agreed to cover the cost of materials. It has the formal approval of the Medical Research Council. Much time and trouble has been spent by the director of Lord Mayor Treloar Haemophilia Centre and his deputy in the detailed planning of this trial. Boys to be included in this trial had to satisfy certain strict criteria and were selected accordingly by the research fellow. The trial commenced during the summer term of 1973, and it is not likely to be completed before the end of the spring term 1975. This trial is one of the most important research studies now being carried out in this county, I think it says, the country might make more sense, on the treatment of haemophilia, and its implications could be profound. And then if we go to MRCO 5065_022, this is an observation by, I think, someone in either the Department of Health or the Medical Research Council on the meeting and the discussion that took place at the meeting in October 72. So it's a note or a memo dated, it's the 8th of November 1972. I attended the meeting of the Haemophilia Centre directors on October the 27th. Several of the agenda items were of interest. but one in particular has special reference for us, the proposed trial of prophylactic therapy. Dr. Biggs had been asked by the equivalent meeting last year to produce a protocol, and it was this that was debated. A subsequent Mark II version of the protocol has been sent to DHSS, and it's the Mark II version that we've received from the Department of Health and Social Security. That would suggest this is a Medical Research Council note. Dr. Biggs said it was clear that no individual haemophilia centre could organise a trial of this type for ethical reasons, apart from anything else, but the Lord Mayor Treloar College at Alton were able to undertake it, and any other centres who could do so were welcome to join. Just pausing there, it's not clear from any of this material why it's thought that ethically it's problematic to conduct this work elsewhere, but it's ethically acceptable to conduct it at Lord Mayor Treloar College on children. Several points concerning the designs of the trial were discussed, and it became apparent that some of the directors present either had reservations about it or disagreed with particular points. Dr. Maycock was asked whether the plasma fractionation laboratory or the blood products laboratory would be able to make the required amounts of factor VIII concentrate, as this might provide a considerable saving compared with buying such concentrate from a commercial firm in Austria at a cost of £15,000 to £20,000. Dr. Maycock replied that he saw no difficulty in producing the material if the appropriate financial assistance and sufficient fresh frozen plasma was available. This statement caused some lively discussion, and it was clear that if more factor VIII concentrate really did become available from PFL or BPL, the haemophilia centre directors would want to use it for treatment rather than in a clinical trial. Dr. Maycock pointed out, however, that it might be possible to increase production given the necessary raw materials and funds on a continuing basis rather than having to spend the available finance on one single batch of factor VIII. In discussion with Dr. Biggs, Dr. Maycock, Dr. Arblaster and Dr. Arenstam, I discovered that all the objections raised by the haemophilia centre directors had already levelled at the protocol, and the version which had been sent to the DHSS took account of them so far as possible. The DHSS were apparently sent the protocol many months ago, and the people who hoped to run the trial clearly now are relying on the Council to speed up the process of decision. There seem to be two main issues. First, should a trial of the type described be carried out? And second, should factor VIII concentrate be provided through Dr. Maycock and Dr. Bidwell or from commercial sources? I think there is a case for the department deciding both these questions in general terms, and then for the Council to play some part in perfecting the design of the trial and becoming involved in an advisory capacity. So there is quite an illuminating insight from the attender from the Medical Research Council at the Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting on the discussions and the concerns that were being expressed about the trial and the question of what product to use. There's also a discussion of the trial at TREL 40521. This is a meeting of the Research Subcommittee of the Wessex Regional Hospital Board, 8th of February 1973. And if we go to the bottom of the second page, there is a discussion of the prophylactic trial in haemophilia. The committee received details of a proposed trial to be carried out at the Lord Mayor Treloar Hospital, Alton, under the direction and control of Drs. Arblaster and Arenstam, to establish whether or not the use of factor VIII material would reduce the incidence of bleeding in haemophiliacs. Top of the next page. Following discussions with the chairman, this proposal had been submitted to the Department of Health and Social Security with the board's support and a request made for funds to finance the research over a period of 3 years. The Department of Health had now written to say it was willing to make available £4,000 for the trial, which would be carried out at Alton, and a small steering committee was being set up by the Department of Health and the Medical Research Council to advise on the protocol and suggest further revisions to the trial plan where this could be done with advantage. The funding of this project will be arranged by the Department of Health direct with the North Hampshire Group. The committee noted this development with satisfaction. So unfortunately that doesn't cast any further light on the question of consideration of ethical implications. If we go to MRCO 5065_011, we zoom in again, it's not always easy to read this. So we can see trial of factor 8 concentrates at Lord Mayor Treloar College, record of a meeting held at 20 Park Crescent, 9th of March 1973. So this appears to be a medical research council meeting, I think. We can see present Dr. Arblaster, Dr. Arenston, Dr. Rainsford, as well as Dr. Bidwell, Dr. Metters from the DHSS, Dr. Stewart from the MRC, and Dr. Bungie, chair. I think one of the earlier memos we looked at was addressed to. And then we can see the chair summarised the events that had led up to the meeting, suggested the role of the MRC might prove to be simply to bring together the people who could contribute to the design and conduct of the proposed trial, and to ensure that adequate arrangements have been made for its organisation and the assessment of results. He suggested that discussion might conveniently be directed to the following 4 subjects: trial protocol, consideration of matters relating to children involved in the trial, consideration of matters relating to the Lord Mayor Treloar College, financial aspects. And then if we go to the discussion on the trial protocol, to the bottom half of the page, we can see it records Dr. Rainsford saying that the proportion of clinically severely affected children at the college was about 25%. And then there's a discussion of the proportion in the population at large. And then the next paragraph says, at the present time, there were only 8 boys at the college who fell into the severe category. Dr. Arenston pointed out that the significance of the results would not be dependent upon only the number of boys in the trial, but also perhaps the total number of bleeds. In order to answer criticisms of the significance, the trial could be extended by a year or whatever time was appropriate, or the college could accept more boys. So there's a suggestion there potentially, or one inference that might be drawn, of recruiting boys to the college so that this could be a trial of greater clinical and research significance. The limitation was not the number of boys who'd be accommodated, but the availability of the factor 8 material. And then we see the chair suggesting the trial should be continued until at least 15 boys have been included, and the results should then be examined with a view to assessing their significance. It was agreed it would not be possible to have 15 in the trial concurrently, since the resultant laboratory workload would be too heavy, but that the trial could be lengthened as required. Dr. Bidwell confirmed that as far as could be foreseen, factor 8 could be provided in sufficient quantity over the period of the trial. It was agreed that the criteria of eligibility for the trial could not be changed for a combination of ethical, statistical and practical reasons. Again, it's not clear what the ethical reasons are. And it was agreed that the trial would be continued with continuous assessment of the significance of the results for as long as necessary. There's then a discussion about the number of bleeds that one would need in order for it to be included in the trial. The last sentence of that paragraph, if the trial was successful, sorry, can we just go up again, Shemik? The use of factor 8 might be extended to those with lower frequency of bleeding. And then there's a discussion about various aspects of the arrangements. The penultimate paragraph on that page says Dr. Arblaster reported that a letter for parents had been prepared, but that it would not be sent out until all the other arrangements for the trial had been confirmed. And then there was a discussion about taking samples on each boy and to confirm factor 8 levels at the bottom of the page. If we go over, we can see the conclusion of the discussion. Costs. Dr. Bidwell pointed out she couldn't readily assess the cost of producing factor 8 in financial terms, but she said to be able to manufacture the additional factor 8 required, provided the number of boys in the trial was never more than 10. Dr. Arenston said that the extra time that the technicians in his haematology department would require would be organised locally. So this meeting appears to be contemplating, contrary to what we saw in the Haemophilia Centre Director's discussion, that there would be a supply of factor 8 for the trial from Dr. Bidwell. We've got various documents associated with the trial, but it's not possible often to tell whether they are early versions of documents or final versions. I'll just look at one example. Therefore, MRCO 5065_021. So this is it's headed Study of Preventative Treatment in Haemophilia, a controlled trial. a data form determination of patient eligibility. If we go to page 3, we can see the criteria for a patient to be eligible. Does the patient have classic haemophilia with a compatible family history and a factor VIII level of 1% or less? If no, then stop, so they're not eligible. Is the age of the patient 7 years or greater? So that's the cutoff, 7 plus. Is the patient a male? Has the patient a bleeding frequency of 7 episodes per 100 days during the past 2 school terms? If yes, eligible for inclusion. If no, they're not. Does the patient have factor VIII inhibitors? If yes, then they're not eligible for inclusion. Is an elective surgical, orthopaedic or other procedure plan which would interfere with the proper execution of the trial? If yes, then again we see stop, so not included. Will the patient be participating in school studies with requirements in conflict with those of this trial? Again, if yes, it's stop. Have the patient and his parents or guardian given their informed consent to participate in and fulfil the requirements of the trial? And again, that's seen as a requirement for eligibility. The answer is, if the answer is no, then they're not to be included. Is all the information on this data form recorded fully? So that's the form. As I said, there are other versions of this document, but which are to similar effect, and it's not clear which is the final version, but there's no marked difference between them for present purposes. And then there's one further document, DHSC 010026_147. I'm not going to go through all of this, and again, it's not clear what the date is, unfortunately. But it's a discussion about the study, so prospective study of preventive treatment in haemophilia. And we can see in the 3rd paragraph, it observes the effects of prophylactic administration of factor VIII concentrates may be complex. For example, a patient may gain sufficient assurance from each treatment as to ignore symptoms which would ordinarily cause him to consult his physician. Conversely, he may be prompted to exert himself more strenuously than he might otherwise and thereby prevent a bleeding episode. The effects of psychological influences on bleeding and haemophilia have been stressed. It would be desirable to control these sources of potential bias by designing a trial with 2 specific requirements. First, the variation among patients might be controlled by a switchback design whereby each patient serves as his own comparison. Secondly, the individual variation of a single patient between placebo and factor VIII might be controlled by employment of a double-blind method. And then we can see over the page, again, the virtues of Lord Mayor Treloar College is an ideal location for the treatment are extolled. An ideal location for carrying out a clinical trial to evaluate prophylaxis would be a centre where a relatively large number of severely affected haemophiliacs are closely observed daily, where the baseline bleeding habits of the patients are known, and where personnel and facilities exist for separating clinical management from trial administration. Such a location is the Lord Mayor Treloar College. And then we can see a discussion of eligibility criteria. I don't propose to go through the details of that, save to note that point 8 is all patients must give their informed consent as defined below prior to the final determination of eligibility. And if we go then to the next page, we can see a heading, Trial Design. Trial for an individual patient will consist of 4 school terms. During 2 of these terms, the patient will receive once-weekly infusions of freeze-dried Australia antigen-screened factor VIII concentrate, and during the other 2 terms, once-weekly infusions of indistinguishable placebo. The designation of these terms as treatment or placebo periods will be made on a random basis. And then it talks about that it might be necessary to delay treatment periods, and the total trial period shall in no instance exceed 6 school terms. And then in terms of obtaining of consent, we look at the bottom of towards the bottom of the page, division of responsibility. Point 1 says, it is hoped that the medical directors of haemophilia units in the boys' home area will be responsible for obtaining consent for inclusion in the trial. So it appears to have been contemplated that Treloar's would not itself obtain consent, but would leave it to the home clinicians to do so. If we go over the page, there's then a discussion of the respective responsibilities of Dr. Rainsford and Dr. Arenstam. Dr. Rainsford was going to be blind to the treatment assignment. Dr. Arenstam would be responsible for trial administration. There is, if we look at paragraph 4, reference to Dr. Tomlinson participating. The physician responsible, Dr. Tomlinson, and staff for therapeutic infusions will administer concentrate or placebo to patients. So that's an oddity given what the evidence elsewhere suggests about Dr. Tomlinson. But in any event, we then have the heading informed consent. After tentative determination of a patient's eligibility, the trial will be explained fully to the patient and the patient's parents or guardian. The following points will be made clear. During the entire trial, each patient will receive an infusion once weekly of either concentrate or placebo. The patient will not be told to which treatment he is assigned. It must be understood that the only safe assumption for the patient to make is that he is assigned to the placebo group. He should act accordingly by not taking undue risks and by promptly reporting symptoms suggesting hemorrhage as usual. Top of the next page, all patients will receive best available treatment as usual for bleeding episodes when they occur, and patients must agree an intention to participate in the trial for 4 full terms. And then there's a further discussion about the administration of the concentrate and so on. So it appears to have been certainly built into the protocol that informed consent along the lines there discussed would be required. You will note that in terms of the matters that are said to be necessary to make clear to patients, there is no discussion of possible risks of receiving prophylactic concentrates, in other words, receiving more concentrates than might otherwise be required for treatment of bleeding on demand. So that any possible enhanced risks of viral infection with hepatitis, for example, are not there identified.
Well, if we go back a couple of pages, at the bottom of the page, what do we make of that?
Well, we're told the placebo will be a hepatitis-free human plasma protein fraction, and is going to appear indistinguishable from the concentrate, but we're not told the concentrate is hepatitis-free.
So we know that is hepatitis-free, at least free of hepatitis B, presumably.
In terms of the placebo, yes. And we're told It's going to be, in terms of the actual concentrate, absolutely, we're told it will be Australia antigen screened. But of course, leaving aside any question over the adequacy of screening for hepatitis B, for Australia antigen, there is the broader question of other forms of viral hepatitis.
Yes.
So those are some of the background documents underpinning the prophylactic trial. Other evidence that we've got suggests that the trial did indeed commence in the summer of 1973. We have got one example. It may not be the only example, but it's one example we've got available for display of a discussion by the home clinician with a parent. TREL 40318_012. So this is a letter from a doctor based at the Warwick Hospital, addressed to Dr. Arenstam, April 1973. And it says in the second paragraph, during these holidays, I've had the opportunity to discuss the research project using factor VIII concentrates with the patient and his mother, and they've agreed to cooperate. There's then an update about the patient's condition, and then the last paragraph says that the patient's not had an episode like this for some years. It's very much to be hoped that the new preventive treatments will bring his coagulation time under better control. So that read with the earlier paragraph tends to suggest that this was a discussion about participation in the prophylactic trial. So it would indicate that there has been a discussion with parents, and pupil, but it doesn't tell us what the substance of that discussion was or what information was provided. If we then look at a short update to the Haemophilia Centre directors in early 74 on the trial, it is at CBLA 40187. So this is the minutes of a joint meeting of directors of haemophilia centres and blood transfusion directors, 31st of January 1974. Dr. Arblaster, Dr. Arenstam and Dr. Rainsford were all in attendance. And there's a brief update at page 4 on the prophylaxis trial. So it's paragraph C, trial of prophylaxis at Alton, an interim report. Dr. Arblaster described the aims of the trial and outlined some of the practical difficulties which they'd come across early in the trial. The minutes don't reveal what they are. Dr. Arenstam then described the results of the first 2 terms of the trial. He stressed that the trial was still double-blind. Before leaving this document, if we look at the previous page, and this is just so I don't have to come back to the document, there's reference in the bottom half of the page to a survey of Australia antigen in household contacts of haemophiliacs, and we've seen reference to that previously. But we can see that there is, following a report from Dr. Ingram, it says discussion about this paper included the following topics, and little paragraph 3, a report was made of the tests made at the Alton Centre, brackets Dr. Rainsford. So it appears that there was also participation by the Treloar Centre in this ongoing survey of Australia antigen in the household contacts of haemophiliacs that we know was being undertaken under the auspices of the Haemophilia Centre directors at this time. If we then pick up the progress of this trial at NHBT 0107241, this is one of the termly reports that we've previously looked at. This is authored by Dr. Rainsford in January 1975, and it's reporting on the summer term 1974 and the autumn term 1974. We looked previously at what was said at the bottom of page 2 and 3 about the hepatitis outbreak, but if we go to page 4, we see reference to the prophylactic trial. So under the heading Research Programme, Prophylactic Trial, this trial is now complete and a report is being prepared. A new research programme to cover the next three years has been formulated, and acceptance of this programme is awaited from the National Fund for Research. And then we can see reference to 2 preliminary work on that and other projects, including the hepatitis project. So if we look further down, we see the date, January 75. We're told the prophylactic trial has been completed. And then if we pick matters up in the Haemophilia Centre Directors Meeting of September 1975, OXUH 303735, we see the date at the top of the page, 18th of September 1975. Dr. Arenstam, Dr. Kirk and Dr. Rainsford are all present. If we go then to page 8, we can see towards the bottom of the page an update about the trial of prophylactic treatment. Dr. Arenstam gave a report on the trial of prophylaxis at the Lord Mayor Treloar College at Alton. He presented the data which was being prepared for publication. He said that there was evidence that the boys in the treatment group were protected for 48 hours following a dose of factor 8. Dr. Arenstam said he'd had encountered difficulty in organising the trial and felt that an extension of the trial should not include a placebo dose. And then there's a discussion following an intervention from Dr. Cash that prophylaxis could result in an annual dosage of more than 70,000 units of factor VIII per patient per year. And then someone else points out that quite small doses were often effective for on-demand therapy and that even less might be required for prophylaxis. Dr. Stewart proposes the trial be continued on a regime of 2 doses a week at a particular level. Action, it was agreed to recommend that the trial be continued at 2 dose levels. And then I'll come back to this. Actually, whilst we're here, we might as well pick it up here. There's a discussion of 2 other aspects of research being undertaken at Treloar's at this time. The continuation on this page refers to a proposed pilot study of hepatitis in haemophilic patients, and I'll come on to that this afternoon. But you'll see Dr. Kirk is referred to as introducing a paper on a proposal to study the incidence of hepatitis in haemophilia patients who've received material of known types. He was proposing as a pilot study to keep detailed records on the following patients. And then we see reference to Treloar's, Newcastle and Oxford. I'll just concentrate on Treloar's. At Treloar College, 20 patients receiving cryoprecipitate, 10 patients receiving cryobilin and 5 patients receiving Elstree factor VIII. And the bottom of the page says, any director who would like to contribute to the study should contact Dr. Kirk at Lord Mayor Treloar College. A requirement for participation in this trial is that the patient should receive only one type of material for treatment, and that samples for virology testing be collected and sent to Dr. Cossart at the Virus Reference Laboratory. There was some discussion about the collection of samples for liver function tests and virus testing, and it was felt that it was important to arrange for as many tests as possible. But it was also felt that the frequent testing of patients, particularly those on home therapy, could be difficult. Therapeutic material should be saved for virus testing in case new types of tests were developed. So you just may wish to note, sir, that it appears to have been regarded as something that could be achieved for research purposes to keep a patient on one type of concentrate for the purposes of research, but more broadly for the purposes of treatment, we've seen that wasn't the approach that was taken. If we go to page 4, there's a further discussion about hepatitis and liver function tests in the bottom half of this page. This is in the context of the director's study of jaundice and factor VIII antibodies. It says there was a full discussion about the incidence of hepatitis, the problem of anecdotic cases, Professor Stewart thought that the cases of hepatitis should be more precisely defined according to the criteria on which the diagnosis was made. And then we can just see a slight difference of approach between Dr. Kirk and Dr. Rainsford. It was felt that future statistics should include liver function test results, and that's said to be the view of Dr. Krask and Dr. Kirk, though others felt that liver function test results were often difficult to interpret, and that's said to be the views of Dr. Maycock and Dr. Rainsford. But in any event, there we have an update on the prophylaxis trial. If we go to MRCO 5065_005.
Just
Yes.
Before you do, the last 5 lines there.
Professor Ingram, the influence on the pool size of material used for fractionation was discussed. Professor Ingram said that NHS factor VIII was derived from pools of 500 to 750 donations, whereas the commercial factor VIII was often derived from pools of 2,000 to 6,000 litres of plasma, and that the probability of including an infected donation was greater. Top of the next page. Sorry, do you need the OXUH 303735? And if we go to the top of page 5. This was greater with commercial factor VIII. And then there's a discussion about not issuing for use material that was hepatitis B antigen positive. Is that the passage to which you were referring?
Yes, thank you.
So then if we just go to MRCO 5065_005, and if we can zoom in, it's very difficult to read. So this is a letter from Dr. Arenstam to the Medical Research Council, 22nd of July 1975, and we can see it's headed Prophylaxis and Haemophilia. And he says, you may remember chairing a meeting at the Medical Research Council 3 years ago when we discussed the protocol for a double-blind controlled trial of prophylactic therapy in haemophilia. Dr. Arblaster, who's now in Arabia, and myself, together with Dr. Rainsford, attended for the Treloar Haemophilia Centre where the trial has been carried out. We've now gone as far as we can with this trial in the face of, I may say, enormous difficulties, which I feel were a direct result of using a placebo for this study. We've had to make some modifications to the original protocol, but nevertheless, I believe our final report, a copy of which I enclose, has done what we set out to do. That is to establish that prophylactic therapy actually works. And we can see a published paper on the trial at NHBT 5091_036. Prophylaxis and Haemophilia, a double-blind controlled trial. It's reported in the British Journal of Haematology in 1976, and we can see it was received for publication in July 75. I'm not going to go through the detail of the report because it's several pages long, and it would be, it would, I think, take a disproportionate amount of time. But we can see summary. A double-blind controlled trial of prophylactic factor VIII therapy has been carried out on 9 severe haemophiliacs at the Lord Mayor Treloar College. Infusions were given once weekly and calculated to give a post-infusion plasma concentration of at least 0.25 IU per milliliter of factor VIII. And then it's said to have reduced the overall bleeding frequency by 15%. The bleeding frequency in the first 3 days post-infusion reduced by 66%. A moderate overall reduction in morbidity was also achieved. It's calculated that to reduce the incidence of bleeding in severe haemophiliacs by 15% would require a 73% increased usage of therapeutic materials. More than twice this amount of material is likely to be needed to reduce the bleeding frequency of the same group by 66%. So that's a summary of the findings. I'll just look very briefly at a couple of pages. Second page, under the heading Materials and Methods, describes how the trial was conducted. We can see the eligibility criteria. The third paragraph asserts that the nature of the trial was fully explained to the eligible boys, and their parents or guardians were asked to give their consent. If this was obtained, the boy was admitted to the trial. As we've seen, the indications from the documents are that that was a process, as it were, delegated to the home treating clinician, rather than directly undertaken by the clinicians at Treloar's. Then there is a description on the following page of each of the 9 boys. And then if we go over to the 4th page, we can see set out the results in both tabular and narrative form. 9 boys studied for a total of 27 boys' school terms, 97 infusions of high dose and 95 of low dose material given. And then if we go to page 7, we can see development of inhibitors, no case of an inhibitor developed during the trial, no case of hepatitis-associated antigen developed during the trial, although 1 boy developed antigen-negative hepatitis 23 days after entering the trial. He was withdrawn for the remainder of that term. And then the discussion is probably something that merits reading in full by you, sir, rather than me simply reading out.
Yes.
But it talks about what might be required by way of dosage in order to achieve therapeutic benefit. And if we go over the page, the last paragraph refers to problems in the trial. may be what Dr. Aronson was referring to earlier when he described practical difficulties in the trial, or it may not. It said some bleeds were bound to occur shortly after infusions of low-dose material. Sooner or later, a crop of bleeds will occur. On one occasion, 4 boys were together in the sick bay within 24 hours of a low-dose infusion. They concluded that the material was the cause for their bleeding, and it was difficult to persuade them to remain in the trial. 2, in fact, dropped out soon after this episode. The giving of a dose interferes with the boys' leisure and schooling, and when inert material is being given, say placebo, this may not now be easily justified. In our view, future trials should compare only probably effective prophylactic regimens and should not include placebo doses. So that's the first trial of prophylaxis. I'm not going to go through the same level of detail in relation to the other trials of prophylaxis, because really we've seen the groundwork and the framework in the documents we've looked at and the involvement of the Department of Health and Medical Research Council. But we can see, if we go to RLIT 5084, a later publication, Twice Weekly Prophylactic Therapy in Haemophilia A, reported in 1977. So this is a later trial of prophylactic treatment, and the summary tells us that the factor VIII containing materials were administered to 4 severely affected haemophiliacs twice weekly in doses calculated to raise the factor VIII level to either 15 or 30% of average normal, and then it suggests that the results from the patients showed a significant reduction in bleeding frequency on both doses in the first 48 hours, and so on. And if we just go back to the text on this page, the first paragraph refers to the previous prophylactic trial, and then if we pick it up, bottom of the left-hand side of the page, please. In view of the implications for the limited financial and human resources available to service such a commitment, it's important to confirm these findings, so that the findings of the earlier trial, and to establish the lowest dose, which might be beneficial. The work reported here is a step along that path. So this was seen as building on the prophylactic work previously undertaken. Details are given on the second page of the trial design. If we look at bottom of the page, we see the heading on the left-hand side, prophylactic materials. We can see that this was a trial that involved cryoprecipitate, apparently, but also involved cryobuline. And then we'll just look at the last page. And under the heading, I'm so sorry, the page before that. So there's a heading discussion. If we go to the right-hand side, if I pick it up in, the top half of the page, right-hand side, second paragraph, from the data presented, it might reasonably be concluded that the 24-hourly prophylactic administration of a dose of factor VIII calculated to raise the level to 30% would reduce the bleeding frequency by 90%. The application of a similar calculation to that explained above suggests that such a commitment would need nearly 9 times the amount of therapeutic material currently in use for haemophiliacs with comparable bleeding frequencies. Clearly, this sort of commitment is not possible with known therapeutic materials, given the current limitations of human and financial resources, particularly in the UK. And then we can see that the authors then say that they think further work in this field should be directed towards the possible benefits of limited periods of prophylaxis. So that's the next, as it were, step along the line of investigation of prophylaxis undertaken at Treloar's. So I'll just mention then that there was then a third trial of prophylactic treatment, and that it did indeed, as anticipated here, look at short-term prophylaxis and whether that would reduce bleeding frequency. And we know, and I won't go to the documents in relation to this third trial, but we know that the therapeutic material used for that trial included cryoprecipitate, NHS factor VIII, and commercial factor VIII. And it was conducted between 1976 and 1977, with prophylaxis being administered twice weekly to 5 boys and 3 times weekly to 13 boys. And I'll, if we could just go to the very final document of relevance, I think on that third trial, it's Dr. Kirk's update to the Haemophilia Centre directors, PRSC 302268. So it's a meeting of Haemophilia Centre directors, January 1977. And if we go to page 9, I think. Yeah, bottom of the page, we see reference to trial of prophylactic treatment of haemophiliac patients at Alton. Dr. Kirk reported on the third trial of prophylactic treatment at Alton, the aim of which was to see if prophylactic treatment reduces the incidence of bleeds in severely affected haemophilic boys. All patients in the study already had bad joints. Now, this records treatment with cryoprecipitate cryobuline and hemophil, but there are other documents that suggest NHS concentrate used. So I'll check the final published report to see if it clarifies that. And then we can see over the page there's then a discussion about the use of prophylaxis. About halfway down that long paragraph, there's a reference to Dr. Bletcher asking which regime the boys preferred, on-demand or prophylaxis. Dr. Kirk replied that 2 boys with the best results wanted to stop prophylactic treatment, the others wanted to go on. Possibly the 2 boys with good results had forgotten what a bad bleed was like. Professor Stewart felt that prophylactic treatment for haemophiliacs should not be entered into on a large scale until there was sufficient evidence that it was beneficial to the patients. Dr. Rainsford said that the prophylactic trial was aimed to provide information for the future and not with the intention of immediate implementation. So you'll see there some reservations being expressed by some directors as to whether this, as to whether this was an appropriate way in which to treat patients. So that, I think, probably brings me to a convenient point at which to break for lunch.
Yes, we will take a break till 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock.
Thank you, sir.